Hey there, folks. Welcome back to class. I believe it is the 7th of October today, and we are looking at section E, Interlude E, which is talking about fossils. It's, again, kind of one of those short little interlude things, and some of them I've skipped in the past, but this one's kind of important because especially here in Kentucky, I'm trying to make this course as relevant as I can. And so if we'd lived somewhere where there weren't a lot of fossils, it might not be that important. But here in Kentucky, we have fossils everywhere. You can't pick up a rock without finding a fossil of some sort in them. And we have some very famous fossils up here in Louisville as compared to the rest of the state. But so it is kind of an important idea. It's really a fun thing. I mean, if you like to collect rocks, fossils are probably one of the more fun ways of doing it because you can find different kinds of plants and animals. And if you know how old the rocks are and what the species is, you can date the particular rocks and find out where they come from and what species of animal and plant you've found. So it kind of gives an extra oomph to looking at rocks and collecting rocks. So let's talk about fossils here. Again, this is Interlude E, and starts out on page 418. So fossils, as you can imagine, have sort of been around forever. People have found them sticking out of the ground and really didn't know what they were. And for a long, long time, that was true, even as people believed that the earth didn't change. I mean, that how, something dies, it just dies and dissolves and goes away. The idea that something could die and part of it be preserved for a long, long time was kind of unheard of. And so they really didn't know what these things were. A lot of myths, as you can imagine, sort of grew up around what they were finding. They would find these old shark's teeth, and they were teeth from dragons, and just all kinds of things. But as the study of organisms and as science progressed, scientists began to understand that in fact these were organisms that lived a long time ago, and the idea of being extinct, of a species living and a species going away, kind of came from these fossils, as you read here in this section. Paleontologists and paleontology are the ones who study fossils uh, and study life as it lived thousands of years ago. And really, that's the evidence. That's one of the important things about fossils is we would have no evidence, would we, of life, hundreds of years ago, even, or thousands or millions of years ago, if we didn't have these fossils. So they're very, very important for understanding life. I know we're studying things that are not alive, like rocks and weather, but these sorts of things, like rocks, can preserve living things, and so that's why they're very important. Here's some pictures of some fossils, and these, again, a lot of these you can find, especially these in this sandstone, look very familiar to some ones we find here in Kentucky. So what is the process of fossilization? What does it mean when something is fossilized? Well, if you were to find a fossilized bone, then there's not much of the actual bone, or matter of fact, almost none of the actual bone still there. So what's happened is the organic molecules, the carbon-based molecules that made up the living organism, have all sort of decayed, but they've decayed in a special way in that they've decayed slowly enough that new minerals can recrystallize in their place. And so when you look at something that's a fossilized bone, you're looking at rock crystal, but it crystallized using the same minerals and materials that were there before and in the same place. And so all that detail could get preserved in what was once a bone, but is now literally a rock. And this takes quite a bit of time, as you can imagine. So some of the fossils we find from thousands, even tens of thousands of years ago, or organisms like bones from, let's say, a mastodon or something like that, aren't fossils yet. They just haven't had time to fossilize in this normal way. But 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs met their demise, a lot of their bones have had time to fossilize. So if you find a dinosaur bone from that period of time, there's no organic material left. Sorry, Jurassic Park movie folks. There's no DNA left, and so it would be very difficult to remake a dinosaur using DNA. But from mastodons and other living things where their bones have not fully decayed or become fossilized, there is a little bit of DNA left, and so there is some interesting little um, uh, things where people are trying to uh, reanimate the saber-toothed tiger or the mastodon or something like that. So we'll see how that turns out. But anyway, so fossils are formed when essentially an organism dies and their impression is made in some soft material like sand or silt of some sort, and then gets covered up quickly. So you can imagine if something dies and doesn't get covered up, well, then it's more likely to decay from bacteria and that sort of thing and be totally gone, or animals will come and get it. So it's very unlikely that something like that would be fossilized. But if something died and got caught in something and then covered up very quickly, then it's more likely that we would see fossilization that way. A couple different kinds of fossilization I think your book talks about here is where we see body fossils and we see trace fossils. I was saying trace because here you can see some guys, they're actually looking at footsteps. These are footsteps of um, Neanderthal human beings. Um, it looks like an adult and a child, and they were preserved in a volcanic ash that kind of got wet, so it's like cement. They were kind of walking through it, and then got covered up again very quickly, so it preserved the actual footprints. So that would be an example of a trace fossil. Here is a good depiction of how this might happen. And of course, the last part of this is you have to be able to find the fossil. So the fossil has to be buried and then has to be um, reemerge from being buried and then actually found. So the chances are that something got fossilized might be pretty good. The chances are that it gets weathered away so that it's re-exposed is very unlikely. And then that someone will actually come along that knows what they're looking for and find it. So you can imagine that finding fossils is like looking for a needle in the haystack. And so the many, many fossils that we have, you can imagine there's probably 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times more that we just never found, right, or didn't see, or didn't get exposed. So here's where your book talks about body fossils, and so of course these could be frozen or dried fossils. Sometimes here you can see a baby mammoth that was frozen and fossilized that way. In other words, when something freezes like this, it basically freeze dries it. All the water is desiccated or dehydrated to the point where now there's no water, so bacteria and stuff can't get to it, and so literally it's got its skin, its hair. I mean, it's pretty much like it was, except just missing the water. And then, of course, fossils from fossilized bone, and then something called amber, which is fossilized tree sap, basically. So sometimes a tree will flow sap. That sap may trap an insect millions of years ago, and then that sap doesn't um, go away. It gets fossilized, and so now we have something hard that would trap an insect. So you'd have an insect fossil in amber. Other kinds of fossils. Here we see some petrified wood, and that, of course, was a tree that got desiccated. You see these a lot where there was a tree was growing a lot of water, and then suddenly the climate changed quickly. And so rather than decay like we see trees in the woods, a tree falls down in the woods today, it will usually decay in a few years. But if it were to get covered up or, again, desiccated, or in some cases actually falling in water where there's no oxygen. And so it lies in this water. And we think of water as being something that would make something decay. But if there's no oxygen in the water, then there's no organisms that can cause decay. And so these bogs and swamps have very little water, very little oxygen in them. And so there's no organisms there to cause decay. And so they can be fossilized for thousands of years, even millions of years. Um, so there's some other ways. The hard parts are usually what we find, like bone, they get preserved. Sometimes we'll see molds and casts. We saw this when we were talking about Vesuvius, and we found the molds of human beings caught in the ash. That would be kind of an example of a mold um, fossil. Carbonized impressions of bodies and organisms. So again, your cells, your organic molecules are made of carbon, and so when everything else, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the hydrogen, all that goes away, a lot of times the carbon is left and can leave an imprint. Then trace fossils, of course, are fossils of things that organisms have done or places where they've been, like footprints. Maybe the burrows of animals sometimes can get fossilized, feeding marks, that sort of thing. And then chemical fossils are places where uh, you have very small, like bacteria. You've got other kinds of chemicals that only get formed through respiration, and so these might be caused by an organism that gets deposited, and so these are what we would call chemical fossils. The preservation itself, again, has to have special features, either uh, lots of water with no oxygen or something that gets buried quickly. Um, and so these are how we find fossils, specifically hard parts of organisms. We don't see brains and lungs and those sorts of things. We just see the bones and sometimes teeth of an organism. However, there are such things as extraordinary fossils. So there are occasions where the conditions are just right. In other words, a lot of these are places where very fine particles can preserve something that has died. Usually, this is in a shale kind of exposure. And so the shale is made up of just really mud with very, very fine particles. And so, being that it's almost like a high definition, to use a kind of a common term, kind of a high definition fossilization, and you can get fossilized skin and fossilized organs and fossilized uh, um, parts that are not hard, soft parts. And so we've got a few places like that, and they've been very important for showing us some of the insides of organisms. And your book talks about Aeopteryx, the dinosaur that has feathers. And so for a long time, dinosaurs were drawn with this kind of scaly reptile skin. In fact, what we believe today is that most of the dinosaurs had more of a feathery skin, uh, and then are possibly, and many of them are, in fact, descended birds rather descended from dinosaurs. So not all the dinosaurs went away. Some of them are still here, flying around, and they are the descendants. Now, one of the things when we learn about life, we talk about taxonomy. So, in other words, how is life organized? A lot of this is kind of obvious, right? I mean, we are probably more closely related to a chimpanzee than we are to, a worm on the ground, simply because a chimpanzee and ourselves look very similar. And so we probably had an ancestor pretty closely related, not too far back. And so that's what taxonomy does. Taxonomy looks at how we organize organisms in terms of groups, how those groups have common ancestors, ancestors that branch away and make new species, and species that also have become extinct. And so it begins with, of course, the smallest organisms, single cell organisms like bacteria, and we have different kinds of bacteria. The archaea are the bacteria that are probably the first living things on the planet. And they were living in wetlands, and are some of them are what we call extremophiles. They live in places that we just can't imagine something would live, like near a volcano or actually in a volcano. Uh, the pro, the prokarya and the eukarya. The prokarya are the earliest bacteria, earliest single cell organisms that whose DNA was not in a nucleus. We are descended from the eukarya. Our cells have, oops, sorry, going backwards here. Our cells have a nucleus, and our DNA is in our nucleus. So we are eukaryotes from this group. And again, here are some of those organisms, and they're some fossils. Um, but let's talk about here. Let's see. Just going through the book here and seeing what they're asking you to look at. Oh, they're just talking about different kinds of um, fossils, which is very interesting. Um, Here's what I kind of wanted to look at. This is kind of an interesting little chart because it shows you how taxonomists organize organisms, and we're going to walk through the organization of us, Homo sapiens. So up here at the top, we see the species of us, Homo sapiens. That's the most singular. In other words, that's one species, that's us, but we came from down here. So this is how the tree grows. This is where it starts. We said we are eukarya. We our cells have a nucleus, and that nucleus has our DNA in it. We evolved into the animalia, which are the animals. Here we have the plants, here we have the fungi, and here we have the protista. So these are all the organisms that have evolved with eukaryote cells. From Animalia, as an animal, we are chordata, which means we have a notochord. And our notochord, we get it when we're first born as a just a few hundred cells. It later turns into our backbone. But some organisms still have this uh, nodal cord, and that's our relationship. Here you can see all the other animals. Here we have worms and sponges and sea stars and clams and spiders and all these others. And we are a part of this group, Chordata. Now, from Chordata, we evolved as a mammal. So the mammals, of course, have hair and have live offspring for the most part. But here are all the others, Chordatas, chordatas, that have evolved that are not mammals. Of course, birds and reptiles and the things that we think of as groups when we talk about class. From the mammals, we evolved as primates. And of course, the primates have legs and arms, have fairly large brains, uh, um, as opposed to some of these other organisms, such as the deer and then here's bears and dogs and cats, the rodents, the marsupials, and all these others. So we are the primates, and again, included in that are the chimpanzees, the gorillas, that sort of thing. From primates, we evolve into what we call hominids, and so the hominids are again a primate, different from the monkeys, lemurs, gibbons, and all that, in that. They had a tendency to be bigger, had a tendency to walk upright, and at this point are losing their tails. Finally, from hominids, we are from the group Homo. Homo simply means the same. Uh, and These then are different from the orangutans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. These are kind of our direct hominid cousins. And then from Homo, we became Homo sapiens. So there were many other Homo. There was the Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals. Here's Homo erectus. Here's Homo habilis, the first Homo to make tools. And so there are all these others. And so we're the only ones who survived from this Homo group. These other groups have all disappeared. They're all extinct. Homo sapiens, we're the ones who survived, and this is where modern humans come from. So this is an interesting chart, and you can chart any organism this way, whether plant or animal. You can chart any of them using this system where we have domains, kingdoms, phylums, class, orders, families, and then species and genus. And when we talk about a name, because we are Homo sapien, we of course use the genus name Homo first, and then the species name Sapien second. So you'll see that a lot of times when they're talking about the scientific name of an organism, it's usually in two names, and the first is always capitalized and is the genus. The second is always in not italics, but is set off there, and it's the species name. So it's good to know, especially if you do a lot of reading about organisms. So life itself evolves on the planet, probably again from some of these extreme conditions, and that's where these prokaryotes evolved from, because the Earth itself was rather extreme, with lots of volcanoes and seawater and shifting environments and stuff. So there wasn't anything that was very easily habitable to anything living. But the first evidences of life we have show up in rocks about 3.7 billion years. And then finally we get cells of organisms at about 2.5 billion years. And then eventually multicellular organisms show up about a billion to a billion and a half years ago. And again, here are some examples of some of these. Eventually, we see a big mixture of organisms, what we call the Cambrian explosion, at about 500 million years ago. And that's where we saw all these different organisms that have evolved into many different things. And so really, even though life has been around for billions of years, it was relatively simple until about 500 million years ago. And we've already looked at the phylogenetic tree and talked about that. But your book asks the question, is the fossil record complete? And obviously the answer is no. We've already talked about how difficult it is to find a fossil. And so you can imagine there's still lots of holes in what we understand. And now that we have a pretty good handle on genetics and have mapped many organisms genetically, now we're able to start, as terms of taxonomy, we're able to start putting organisms into their groups, not based on just what they look like or what we think, we sort of look like chimpanzees, so we must be related, that sort of thing. But now we're able to put organisms in group based on their DNA. And so that's been very helpful to fill in some of these holes. Even without fossils, we can sort of figure out where things have come from just based on their DNA. So this was a big jump. Now, your book talks about evolution and extinction and begins with Darwin. He was, it's funny, you make a big deal about one person, but really this idea of evolution had been around for a very long time. The idea that organisms are not static, the idea that, God created, a bear in the Garden of Eden, and that bear is exactly the same bear that we see today. I don't think too many people really believe that. We've seen too many organisms change, and we can actually watch change happen in organisms. And so this idea, again, is pretty old. It just happened to be that Darwin was the one who got to the publisher first and published his work first. And he offered a pretty similar to, if you remember when we talked about Alfred Wegener having ideas about continental drift, but he couldn't explain how it happened. Darwin had a pretty good idea now of how evolution happened, and he called it natural selection. And so natural selection, sometimes it's misnamed survival of the fittest. That's not really true. What natural selection basically says is that organisms are going to be born, and organisms are going to have to live in the situation they have, and those organisms with features that are beneficial to them are going to survive and have offspring. Those organisms who are born with physical features or whatever kind of features that are not conducive to their environment are not going to survive and not going to pass on those traits to their offspring. So that's really all that natural selection is. It simply says that as organisms have offspring, there's little bitty changes that happen in those offspring. And if those changes are a good thing, then that offspring will do well and survive and have offspring. And if some of those changes are detrimental to the conditions at that time, then it won't survive. And by that time, I mean climates change. We're witnessing climate change today, brought on a lot by ourselves, but climates change naturally. And so organisms maybe that lived in an area where the climate was one way, and as climate changed, their offspring either adapted or didn't adapt, and that could bring about extinction. And so that's really all this is. I mean, I know we make a big deal out of it, and it is very important. But Darwin didn't know anything about genetics. He didn't know what a gene was. He didn't know what DNA was. And so he's doing all this based just on observation and speculation. And so it's pretty amazing that this idea happens as early as it does. But it is held up over time. And again, it's called the theory of evolution. But again, remember, it's a scientific theory. It's not just a whim, or it's not just somebody's, somebody woke up with an epiphany at some point. This is literally hundreds of years. I mean, it really is. This is literally hundreds of years of data and information, and so it is a real thing. It's not somebody's attempt to undermine scripture or anything like that. It's a real thing. It's how, I mean, if you're a faith person, it's how God decides to populate the planet and organize the planet. So it's something we probably would come to terms with. So that's a very interesting little article here to read. So hope make sure you read that and understand that. So we've already talked a little bit about extinction, and extinctions can happen slowly. Extinctions can happen in what we call extinction events. So they can be large times in Earth's history where large numbers of organisms have disappeared, and usually that happens because of some worldwide catastrophe. It could be volcanism. It could have been the breakup of a supercontinent, or for the dinosaurs, it was a combination of volcanoes and a meteor that hit and caused destruction. But the interesting thing is, every time there's a mass extinction event, life comes back, but slightly different. So the big argument is, if it hadn't been for this meteor hitting and wiping out the dinosaurs, humans, in other words, mammals, probably wouldn't have had an opportunity to flourish on the planet. So even though the loss of dinosaurs was a bad thing for the dinosaurs, for us, it was a good thing. We wouldn't be here if it hadn't happened. So life's kind of funny that way. Well, anyway, here are your review questions if you want to do them on page 433. And I hope everyone has a good day, and I'll see you next time.